Caldwell, a seasoned host with an aggressive for questioned, had spent days preparing reputation for this moment. His producer had promised a balanced conversation, but the look in Caldwell's eyes suggested otherwise. He had built his career on taking down conservative figures on live television, and tonight his target was none other than the newly inaugurated Vice President of the United States. The stage was set for what was expected to be a hard-hitting interview. Vice President J.D. Vance stepped onto the brightly lit studio of the Ethan Caldwell Show, a primetime political talk show known for its sharp, often combative style. As the cameras panned across the packed audience, the tension in the room was palpable. This was not just another interview. This was an opportunity for Caldwell, a well-known liberal journalist, to corner Vance and force him into a defensive position. As Vance took his seat across from Caldwell, he could feel the subtle tension in the room. The usual pleasantries were rushed, almost mechanical, as though the interview was merely a formality before the real battle began. The crew seemed unusually focused, the teleprompter operator barely blinking, the floor director giving hushed instructions. It was clear this wasn't going to be an ordinary discussion. But Vance was no stranger to pressure. Years in the Marine Corps had sharpened his instincts, and right now, those instincts told him that an ambush was coming. He had seen these tactics before: loaded questions, selective quotes, and a well-timed jab meant to rattle him in front of millions of viewers. Yet he remained composed. His posture was relaxed, his expression calm, and his eyes sharp with awareness. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, a polished yet calculated smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his voice laced with feigned politeness, "let's talk about your remarkable transformation from a fierce critic of Donald Trump to his second-in-command. Quite the turnaround, wouldn't you say?" Vance smiled back, the glint of a man who had faced far greater challenges in his life. He had expected this line of questioning. In fact, he welcomed it. Because what Caldwell and his audience didn't know was that he wasn't here to play defense. No, tonight would be different. Tonight, it wouldn't be Vance who found himself on the ropes. It would be Ethan Caldwell. Ethan Caldwell knew exactly where to strike first. The lights in the studio seemed to burn a little brighter as he leaned in, his voice measured but sharp, primed for the first attack. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, "let's talk about your rather remarkable evolution. You once wrote scathing critiques about President Trump. You called him unfit for office, and yet here you are, serving as his vice president. Quite the transformation, don't you think?" There it was. The opening move of what Caldwell thought was a carefully choreographed takedown, a question dripping with accusation, wrapped in the veneer of polite inquiry. J.D. Vance didn't flinch. If anything, he looked almost amused. He leaned back slightly, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had seen far greater battles than this one. "You know, Ethan," Vance began, his voice steady, "that's actually a great place to start. Because it speaks to something much bigger than me. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." The audience leaned in, intrigued. This wasn't the defensive response Caldwell had anticipated. Vance wasn't scrambling for cover, he was stepping forward into the fire. Caldwell's brow furrowed slightly, but he masked it with a smirk. "Growth and understanding? Is that what we're calling it now? Because some might say it looks more like political convenience." Vance's smile didn't fade. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question with genuine curiosity. Then, with the calm precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, he delivered his counterpunch. "You see, Ethan," he said, his voice carrying the quiet weight of conviction, "in America we have this incredible tradition of being able to change our minds when presented with new information. When I criticized President Trump years ago, I was looking at things through a narrow lens. But then I saw something remarkable. I saw how his policies were actually helping the very people I wrote about in my book." Caldwell's fingers tightened around the cue cards in his hands. This wasn't the script he had envisioned. He was supposed to be in control, dictating the narrative. Instead, Vance was turning the conversation into something entirely different, something Caldwell hadn't prepared for. The journalist attempted to regain his footing. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "That's a nice sentiment, Mr. Vice President, but let's be honest. How does a Yale-educated lawyer, a man who built his brand on criticizing the very movement he now champions, expect Americans to believe this isn't just opportunism?" The trap was set. A question designed to force Vance into a defensive position, to make him justify himself. But Vance was already 2 steps ahead. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking on to Caldwell's with the kind of unwavering focus that came from years of military training. "Let me ask you something, Ethan," he said, his voice controlled, almost conversational. "Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at the facts and realized that maybe, just maybe, your initial judgment was wrong?" A flicker of hesitation crossed Caldwell's face. It was brief, but it was there. The studio was dead silent. Even the production crew, who had been moving discreetly in the background, had frozen in place. The audience members who had initially leaned toward Caldwell's argument were now shifting, reconsidering. Caldwell cleared his throat, attempting to dismiss the question. "We're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President, not mine." Vance smiled, tilting his head slightly. He wasn't going to let Caldwell off the hook so easily. "Ah, I see," he said, his voice laced with a quiet amusement. "So, it's perfectly acceptable for people like you to evolve, to learn, to grow, but when someone like me, someone from Middletown, Ohio, dares to do the same, it's political convenience." A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He shuffled his notes as if searching for the next prepared attack. But Vance wasn't done. "You know, Ethan, I find it fascinating how certain people, especially in the media, love to talk about growth and change when it fits their narrative. They celebrate it when a politician moves further left. But the moment someone like me dares to see things differently, dares to say, 'Hey, maybe I was wrong about this,' suddenly, that's betrayal." A smattering of applause broke out. Caldwell's fingers twitched slightly. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. But Vance wasn't just answering questions anymore. He was setting the tone. He was shifting the conversation from an interrogation into something far more powerful. A reckoning. And in that moment, as Caldwell struggled to regain control, it became clear that the ambush he had planned had already started to crumble. Ethan Caldwell knew he was running out of room. J.D. Vance had dismantled every attack so far, turning each question into an opportunity to assert his convictions rather than defend against criticism. The crowd wasn't reacting how Caldwell had hoped. He needed something stronger, something controversial. His fingers gripped his cue cards a little tighter as he adjusted in his seat, flashing a smile that barely concealed the frustration behind his eyes. "All right, Mr. Vice President," Caldwell said, his voice steady but laced with an edge. "Let's talk about faith. Last month at the National Faith and Freedom Conference, you spoke about divine guidance in government decision-making. Some might argue that's a dangerous step toward blurring the lines between church and state." There it was, the shift he had been waiting to make. If he could paint Vance as an extremist, someone pushing a religious agenda in politics, he could undermine his credibility with moderate viewers. But Vance didn't take the bait. Instead, he simply smiled, as if he had been expecting this exact question. "Divine guidance, Ethan," Vance repeated, his tone thoughtful rather than defensive. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith. They were afraid of tyranny." A few murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. Caldwell's expression tightened slightly. He wasn't expecting pushback from the crowd, not yet. He pressed forward. "But in a country as diverse as ours," Caldwell said, carefully choosing his words, "isn't it irresponsible to tie faith so closely to governance? Shouldn't our leaders be focusing on policies rather than invoking religious beliefs?" Vance leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Caldwell. "Let me ask you something, Ethan," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "When I took my oath of office, where did I place my hand?" Caldwell hesitated. "On the Bible," he admitted. "Just like every president and vice president before me," Vance continued. "Not because we're establishing a state religion, but because we acknowledge something fundamental. Our rights don't come from government, they come from God." The audience erupted into applause. Caldwell clenched his jaw. He hadn't expected the room to turn this quickly. His producer was watching from behind the cameras, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. He needed to take control again. "You also recently said that President Trump was God's instrument for America's renewal," Caldwell pushed, his voice sharpening. "That's a bold statement. Don't you think that's a bit extreme?" Vance's expression didn't change. If anything, his gaze grew steadier. "What I think is extreme," he said evenly, "is how some in the media are more concerned with a leader who prays than with policies that hurt American families." A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Caldwell felt the momentum slipping further. "But since you brought up President Trump," Vance continued, "let's talk about results instead of rhetoric. Let's talk about what's actually happening in our communities since this administration took office." Caldwell opened his mouth to interject, but Vance didn't give him the chance. "You want to challenge my faith, Ethan?" Vance asked, his voice unwavering. "Fine, but understand this. You're not just challenging me. You're challenging millions of Americans who wake up every morning, work hard, raise their families, and hold on to their faith, not because it's politically convenient, but because it's the foundation of their lives." The room was dead silent. Even Caldwell, usually quick on his feet, seemed at a loss for words. "Faith isn't a political prop," Vance continued. "It's what carried my grandmother through hard times when she had to raise me alone. It's what kept my fellow Marines steady in the face of danger. And it's what keeps this country standing, whether you want to acknowledge it or not." A single clap echoed through the studio, then another. Then the entire audience broke into applause. Caldwell's grip on his cue cards tightened. This wasn't going the way he had planned. Desperate to move on, he forced a thin smile. "Well, I think we've covered that topic quite extensively," he said quickly, shuffling his papers. "Let's move on." Vance sat back, his composure unshaken. He knew exactly what had just happened, and judging by the look on Caldwell's face, so did he. Ethan Caldwell had to shift strategies. Caldwell needed something more personal, something that would force Vance into an uncomfortable position. He straightened his posture, forcing a smirk. "Mr. Vice President," he began, flipping through his cue cards, "let's talk about something that's been a recurring theme in your story, your humble beginnings. You've spoken at length about your childhood in Middletown, Ohio, about growing up in a struggling working-class family. But now here you are, sitting in the halls of power, wearing an expensive suit, defending a billionaire. Some might say you've forgotten where you came from." It was a sharp pivot, a direct attempt to paint Vance as a hypocrite. Caldwell sat back, watching carefully for any crack in Vance's armor. But Vance remained calm. He let the silence hang for a moment before responding, his tone measured. "That's interesting, Ethan," he said, a faint smile on his lips, "because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by how well they fit into the Washington elite's expectation." Caldwell's smirk wavered. "Let me ask you something," Vance continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Do you think the values I learned from my grandmother, the values of hard work, faith, and resilience, disappear the moment you step into a tailored suit? Do you think integrity has a price tag?" Caldwell tried to cut in, but Vance wasn't finished. "Because I'll tell you what I see," Vance pressed on, his eyes locking onto Caldwell's. "I see someone who thinks an expensive suit can change a man's values. Let me tell you something. These values," he placed a hand on his chest, "the ones I learned growing up in Middletown, Ohio, they don't change with your zip code or your job title." A murmur of approval swept through the audience. Caldwell clenched his jaw. He wasn't done yet. "That's a nice sentiment, Mr. Vice President," Caldwell shot back, his voice taking on a harder edge. "But let's be honest, your transformation wasn't just about personal growth. It was about political ambition. You built your reputation criticizing Donald Trump, and now you're his most loyal defender. Isn't that just a little too convenient?" The trap was set. Caldwell had framed the question in a way that left Vance with few good options. If he admitted his political rise was calculated, he would look opportunistic. If he denied it outright, he risked sounding naive. But once again, Vance refused to take the bait. "You know, Ethan," he said, leaning forward slightly, "it's funny how people like you love to talk about change when it benefits your side. When a politician moves further left, you call it growth. But when someone like me, someone who actually spent time in the communities these policies affect, dares to see things differently, suddenly it's opportunism." Caldwell opened his mouth, but Vance kept going, his voice growing stronger. "Yes, I criticized President Trump before," Vance admitted. "And you know what takes real character? Admitting when you were wrong, standing up for what you believe in, even when people like yourself try to twist it into something else." The audience stirred again, nodding and whispering amongst themselves. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You want to talk about political ambition?" Vance continued. "All right, let's talk about yours." The audience audibly reacted. Caldwell's smirk faded. "You sit there and act like an impartial journalist, but let's be honest, Ethan. Your job isn't to inform, it's to frame, to spin, to push a narrative. You didn't invite me here for a fair discussion, you invited me here to humiliate me, to turn this into a spectacle. But here's the thing." Vance paused, letting the silence hang. "You underestimated me." A gasp rippled through the audience. The word hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Vance didn't blink. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "That word," he said, his voice quiet but cutting, "it says more about you than it does about me." Caldwell swallowed. "In your world, Ethan, loyalty is something to mock. But let me tell you what I learned as a Marine. When you're in combat, you don't judge a man by what the media says about him. You judge him by his actions. And I've seen President Trump's actions firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues try to create." The audience erupted in applause. Some even stood. Caldwell's attempt at control was gone. His entire strategy had collapsed under the weight of Vance's steady presence. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell had nothing to say. Ethan Caldwell was out of moves. Every carefully crafted attack, every attempt to corner J.D. Vance had unraveled before his eyes. Desperate to regain control, he cleared his throat and glanced at the clock. "Well, I think we're just about out of time," Vance smiled, shaking his head slightly. "That's interesting, Ethan. You've been checking the time ever since we started talking about faith and values. Uncomfortable territory for you?" The audience chuckled. Caldwell forced a tight-lipped smile, but the nervous flicker in his eyes betrayed him. "For someone who prides himself on hard-hitting journalism," Vance continued, "you seem remarkably eager to change the subject when the conversation doesn't go your way." The room was silent, except for the scattered applause from audience members who had been watching this unfold with growing admiration for Vance's composure. Caldwell shifted in his seat. He was running out of options. "Mr. Vice President, let's not make this personal." Vance leaned forward, his tone calm but commanding. "This was never personal, Ethan. This is about the millions of Americans who have been told they're on the wrong side of history simply for believing in their faith, their family, and their country. This is about respect. Respect for people who don't need the media's approval to know what they stand for." A standing ovation erupted from the audience. Caldwell sat frozen, his plan having crumbled under the weight of a truth he hadn't anticipated. Vance stood, straightened his tie, and turned to face the cameras. "To every American watching tonight, you've seen firsthand what happens when someone refuses to be shamed for their beliefs. They thought they could trap me with my own words, but the truth is simple. Character isn't about never changing your mind. It's about having the courage to stand firm in what you believe, even when the world tries to tear you down. He took a breath, scanning the audience with sincerity. If you've ever been mocked for your faith, your values, or your patriotism, stand strong. You are not alone. As Vance walked off the set, the energy in the room was undeniable. Caldwell sat in stunned silence, knowing that this was more than just an interview. This was a statement. And that's the lesson, isn't it? Sometimes the most powerful answer to arrogance is quiet conviction, and the strongest response to bias is truth. What do you think? Was J.D. Vance right to stand his ground? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in faith, family, and freedom, don't forget to like and subscribe. God bless you, and God bless America.